Lunch once revealed how Americans survived, not how they impressed. In rural kitchens of the early 20th century, meals were shaped by distance, poverty, and habit. These recipes mattered because they fed workers, children, and elders when resources were thin and time was scarce. Today, those lunches are nearly erased, replaced by convenience and spectacle. This video restores that lost midday table. Each recipe you will hear was once trusted, repeated, and necessary. If these meals disappear from memory, a crucial chapter of American food history disappears with them. Stay with this story, because understanding lunch explains how families endured. Before noon bells rang across rural America, many lunches were already prepared. Fried cornmeal mush was one of the most dependable midday foods in early 20th century kitchens. It was cooked the night before, poured into pans, and left to set by the stove. By morning, it became firm enough to slice. This mattered because it stretched a handful of cornmeal into meals that lasted days. Cornmeal mush was not a novelty dish. It appeared in Appalachian cabins, Midwestern farmhouses, and lumber camps where wheat flour was scarce. Cooks boiled cornmeal slowly in salted water until thick, then spread it out to cool. At lunchtime, slices were fried in pork drippings until crisp on the outside and soft inside. Sometimes it was eaten plain. Sometimes it was paired with beans, molasses, or leftover greens. This recipe worked because it respected limits. Corn grew where other grains failed. Mush required no oven, no yeast, and no fresh ingredients. It could be reheated quickly and carried easily to fields or workshops. Children recognized its smell. Adults trusted its strength. It filled stomachs without waste. Fried mush also reflected routine. Families planned meals around what could be prepared once and reused. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was discarded. Lunch was quiet, filling, and predictable. That predictability kept households running through long workdays. Today, fried cornmeal mush survives mostly as memory. Its simplicity hides the labor and judgment behind it. Yet this dish explains how rural families fed themselves with consistency and care. It reminds viewers that survival often depended on restraint, repetition, and quiet knowledge passed between generations at the table. These lunches taught endurance without speeches, celebrations, or praise, only results measured by hunger-satisfied daily life. In the next part, another forgotten lunch reveals how preservation and patience shaped the American table. Lunch in early 20th century America often depended on what could wait without spoiling. Cold baked bean sandwiches were a quiet staple in rural households, especially in New England and mill towns. This lunch mattered because it allowed families to turn a single pot of beans into nourishment across several days, without reheating or waste. Baked beans were prepared slowly on Saturdays, using navy beans, molasses, salt pork, and thyme. The pot stayed near the stove overnight, absorbing heat and patience. By Sunday and Monday, the beans had thickened and darkened. At lunch, they were spooned cold between slices of homemade bread or split biscuits. No garnish was required. The beans were the meal. This practice reflected necessity, not preference. Midday breaks were short. Fuel was precious. Cold beans required no fire and no supervision. Workers could eat quickly and return to fields, looms, or workshops. Children carried bean sandwiches wrapped in paper, sturdy enough to survive pockets and pails. The dish worked because baked beans improved with time. Flavor deepened as the sauce settled into the beans. Bread absorbed moisture, making the sandwich filling rather than messy. Protein, sugar, and starch combined into steady energy that lasted through afternoon labor. This lunch also showed restraint. Families accepted repetition as stability. Eating the same food meant predictability, not failure. It meant planning had succeeded. Nothing spoiled. Nothing was thrown away. The kitchen stayed disciplined. Today, cold-baked bean sandwiches are rarely remembered. Their plainness conceals the intelligence behind them. They were portable, economical, and dependable. They answered the question every rural cook faced at noon: how to feed many with little, again and again. The next forgotten lunch reveals how preservation and texture helped families stretch vegetables beyond their season. By midday, many early 20th century lunches relied on what had already been cooked and could be trusted to last. Boiled potato hash was one such meal, common in farming regions and mining towns. This dish mattered because it transformed leftovers into sustenance without waste or delay. Potatoes were boiled in large batches, often with their skins left on to save time. Once cooled, they were chopped and mixed with onion, salt, and small amounts of fat saved from earlier meals. At lunch, the mixture was pressed into a pan and cooked until a crust formed. The interior stayed soft. The outside held together. It could be eaten hot or at room temperature. This lunch existed because nothing could be discarded. Potatoes stored well, traveled easily, and fed many. Hash required no precise measures and no special equipment. It relied on judgment, heat, and patience. Each household produced a slightly different version, shaped by what remained in the kitchen. Boiled potato hash worked because it respected routine. Cooking happened once. Eating happened many times. The dish could be cut into portions and shared without ceremony. It filled plates quietly and consistently. Workers returned to labor without distraction. Children recognized it as familiar and reliable. This meal also reflected discipline. Fat was used carefully. Seasoning was minimal. Texture mattered more than appearance. A crisp edge signaled success. A soft center meant nourishment. Lunch did not seek attention. It served purpose. Today, potato hash is often misunderstood as a secondary dish. In its original form, it was a complete meal built from planning and restraint. It showed how early American kitchens valued continuity over variety. The next lunch uncovers how preserved dairy and bread formed dependable midday meals when fresh food was uncertain. At noon, when fresh meat was uncertain and work could not stop, many households relied on milk toast. This lunch mattered because it turned basic pantry items into nourishment that could be prepared quickly and eaten without strain. Milk toast appeared across rural America in the 20th century, especially where cows were kept and bread was baked weekly. Cooks warmed milk slowly with salt and a small amount of butter. Slices of stale bread were toasted to firmness, then broken into bowls and covered with the hot milk. The result was soft, steady, and filling. This dish existed for practical reasons. Milk was available even when markets were distant. Bread that had hardened found purpose again. The meal required no chewing strength and no complicated timing. It served children, laborers, and elders with equal care. At lunch, it could be eaten quickly or slowly, depending on the day. Milk toast worked because it conserved energy. It used gentle heat. It required few utensils. It produced warmth without heaviness. The balance of fat, starch, and liquid provided calm endurance through afternoon work. Nothing spoiled. Nothing was discarded. The dish also reflected a deeper habit. Kitchens planned for reuse. Stale bread was expected, not feared. Milk was measured carefully. Butter was added sparingly. Lunch rewarded patience rather than appetite. Today, milk toast is often dismissed as plain. That judgment misses its purpose. It was designed for reliability, not excitement. It answered the same question faced by rural cooks: how to feed everyone at noon with certainty and restraint. Remembering milk toast restores the logic of American lunches. It shows how comfort came from consistency and how care was expressed through quiet meals daily. In the next part, another forgotten lunch reveals how cured meat and simple grains sustained workers far from home. By midday, families often relied on portable, lasting foods to sustain long workdays. Salted pork and cornbread was one such staple in Southern and Midwestern households. This lunch mattered because it combined protein and starch in a form that traveled well and required no reheating. Salted pork was cured carefully, sliced thin, and stored in cool pantries. Cornbread was baked in iron skillets. its edges crisp and golden. At lunch, a slice of cornbread wrapped around a piece of salted pork provided a meal that could be eaten in the fields, on riverbanks, or at workbenches. It was practical, sturdy, and filling. This combination existed out of necessity. Fresh meat was rare. Firewood was precious. Corn was abundant. Families stretched every ingredient. Cornbread absorbed the salt and fat, creating flavor while minimizing waste. Children and adults alike depended on it for energy that lasted through long hours. Salted pork and cornbread worked because it respected storage and portability. Pork did not spoil quickly when cured. Cornbread kept its form without crumbling. Together, they created a balance of sustenance that required no utensils, no plates, and no time-consuming preparation. The meal also reflected routine and discipline. Slices were measured. Portions were respected. Families accepted repetition as comfort and survival. It was a quiet, dependable solution rather than a spectacle. Lunch was eaten with attention to efficiency, not presentation. Today, salted pork and cornbread survives mainly in cookbooks and memory. Its simplicity masks its intelligence. This combination shows how American families planned midday meals to feed many with limited resources. It demonstrates that survival often depended on foresight, preservation, and patience. In the next part, another forgotten lunch uncovers how beans, fat, and slow cooking created meals that could last the entire workday without spoiling. By midday, many American families relied on meals that could endure the hours without refrigeration or constant attention. Hasty pudding, a simple grain porridge, was a trusted lunch in rural kitchens of the early 20th century. This dish mattered because it provided warmth, sustenance, and a measure of comfort using ingredients that were inexpensive and widely available. Hasty pudding was prepared from cornmeal or wheat flour boiled slowly in water or milk until it thickened. Often, a small amount of fat or molasses was added for richness and flavor. Once cooked, it could be eaten hot, cooled, or even carried to the fields in a container for workers or children. It required minimal preparation yet supplied steady energy for long afternoons. This dish existed because it was flexible. Grains stored well and could be used throughout the week. Hasty pudding required little supervision, making it ideal for households where mothers or older children were busy with other chores. Its texture was soft enough for young children yet filling for adults performing manual labor. Hasty pudding worked because it balanced nutrition, economy, and convenience. It transformed humble grains into a meal that sustained multiple family members with minimal resources. A pinch of salt, a drizzle of syrup, or a spoonful of butter could change the flavor slightly while maintaining its practicality. The meal also reflected discipline and routine. Ingredients were measured carefully. Cooking was timed precisely. Portions were shared evenly. Every household had a version, shaped by local tastes, available grains, and family preference. Today, hasty pudding is largely forgotten outside historical texts. Yet it exemplifies how early American families managed midday sustenance. It demonstrates that nourishment relied not on novelty but on patience, skill, and an understanding of simple ingredients. In the next part, we will explore how leftover vegetables and careful seasoning transformed humble greens into a lunch that lasted through the week. By midday, when work demanded energy and fresh food was scarce, stewed cabbage with salt pork was a dependable lunch across early 20th century American kitchens. This dish mattered because it stretched a single head of cabbage into a meal that could feed an entire family while using little fuel or fresh meat. Cabbage was chopped coarsely and simmered slowly with small slices of salt pork. The pork added fat and flavor, while the cabbage softened and absorbed the richness. Occasionally, onions or a pinch of molasses were added to deepen the taste. Once cooked, it could be eaten hot or at room temperature, often alongside bread or potatoes. This lunch existed because of necessity. Fresh vegetables were seasonal. Meat was preserved rather than freshly butchered. Families depended on combinations that maximized flavor and nutrition from limited ingredients. Stewing required patience but no constant attention, allowing cooks to manage other household tasks simultaneously. Stewed cabbage with salt pork worked because it balanced sustenance and economy. The cabbage provided bulk and vitamins. The pork supplied fat and protein. Cooking slowly over low heat allowed flavors to meld while using minimal fuel. Portions were easy to share, and leftovers could last several meals. The meal also reflected routine. Families accepted repetition as stability. Recipes were passed down with small variations, depending on the size of the cabbage, the thickness of the pork, and available seasonings. Lunch was a quiet, reliable ritual, not a performance. Today, stewed cabbage with salt pork is rarely remembered. Yet it exemplifies how early Americans converted simple ingredients into filling, practical meals. It demonstrates that resilience in the kitchen depended on careful preparation, thrift, and understanding how to stretch humble foods. In the next part, we will see how preserved root vegetables created a versatile, sustaining lunch that traveled well and lasted through the workday. By midday, root vegetables played a crucial role in American lunches, especially during winter months when fresh produce was scarce. Turnip and carrot mash was a practical and dependable dish. This lunch mattered because it used simple, stored ingredients to produce a filling meal capable of sustaining families through long afternoons of work. Turnips and carrots were peeled, chopped, and boiled until tender. They were then mashed together with a small amount of fat, often saved from previous meals, and lightly salted. Sometimes a spoonful of molasses or milk was added to improve flavor and texture. The mash could be served hot or allowed to cool for later consumption. This dish existed out of necessity. Fresh vegetables were rarely available in winter. Root crops stored well in cellars or cool pantries. Families depended on them to supplement limited protein sources and starches like potatoes or bread. Mash transformed these humble roots into a cohesive, nourishing lunch. Turnip and carrot mash worked because it combined durability, nutrition, and simplicity. The mash could be portioned easily and eaten by children or adults in the fields, workshops, or at home. Its preparation required no precise timing, few utensils, and minimal fuel. The meal also reflected discipline and routine. Peeling and chopping were done carefully to avoid waste. Seasoning was modest, focusing on sustenance rather than taste. Leftovers could be reheated or eaten cold, ensuring that nothing went to waste. Today, turnip and carrot mash is rarely recalled outside old cookbooks, but it illustrates how early American families made the most of available resources. It demonstrates that resilience and practicality defined rural lunches, long before convenience became a priority. In the next part, we will uncover how simple, preserved grains combined with fats to create a portable, sustaining lunch for workers far from home. By midday, long hours of work often required portable meals that could last without refrigeration. Oatcakes with lard were one such lunch, common in Appalachian and rural northern households of the early 20th century. This dish mattered because it combined durability, energy, and simplicity, providing nourishment that traveled well and required no reheating. Oatcakes were made by mixing coarse oatmeal with a small amount of lard, water, and salt. The dough was pressed into thin rounds and cooked on a griddle until firm and lightly browned. Once cooled, the oatcakes could be carried in pockets or wrapped in cloth. They were eaten alone, spread with a little preserved fruit, or paired with salted meat. This lunch existed because it was economical and reliable. Oats stored well for months. Lard added calories and flavor without spoiling quickly. Families depended on oatcakes to stretch grains into a meal capable of sustaining workers, children, and elders during long days. Oatcakes with lard worked because they balanced nutrition and portability. Each cake provided energy, fat, and some protein. Cooking was simple and required minimal fuel. Portions were easy to measure, and leftovers were resilient. The texture made them suitable for travel, allowing lunches to endure without supervision or immediate consumption. The meal also reflected routine. Every household had its variation, shaped by available ingredients. Families valued repetition as a mark of stability and efficiency. Lunch was not a spectacle but a practical solution to everyday hunger. Today, oatcakes with lard are nearly forgotten outside historical texts, yet they exemplify how American families relied on simple, preserved ingredients to meet the demands of work and travel. They reveal a system of careful planning, patience, and resourcefulness that defined rural midday meals. In the next part, we will explore how simple preserved dairy and breads created lunches that were dependable, nourishing, and widely shared across households. By midday, many early 20th century American households relied on cheese and biscuit sandwiches for a quick and sustaining lunch. This meal mattered because it combined two staple ingredients, bread and preserved dairy, into a portable, filling dish that required no reheating and minimal preparation. Biscuits were baked in iron skillets, their edges crisp and centers soft. Cheese, often a firm, aged variety, was sliced thin and placed between the biscuits. Sometimes a small smear of butter or a pinch of salt enhanced the flavor. The sandwiches could be eaten hot, if fresh from the oven, or carried cold to fields, workshops, or schoolrooms. This dish existed because fresh food was not always available. Cheese stored well for weeks, and biscuits could be made in bulk and kept in cloth-lined containers. Families relied on these ingredients to create meals that traveled well, provided energy, and satisfied hunger until supper. Cheese and biscuit sandwiches worked because they balanced protein, fat, and starch. They were simple to assemble, easy to portion, and could be eaten by children or adults alike. The combination required no utensils and left little waste. Its simplicity allowed cooks to focus on other household duties while still providing reliable nutrition. The meal also reflected routine and discipline. Ingredients were used efficiently. Portions were consistent. Repetition was valued as a mark of household stability. Lunch was practical, dependable, and quiet, not a display of culinary skill. Today, cheese and biscuit sandwiches are rarely remembered outside historical texts. Yet they illustrate how early American families transformed limited ingredients into sustaining midday meals. They remind us that practicality, preservation, and careful planning defined rural lunches more than novelty or presentation ever did. In the next section, we will reflect on these forgotten lunches as a whole, understanding how necessity, routine, and resourcefulness shaped the American table for generations.